Many people regard you as a personification of Ubuntu. What do you understand Ubuntu to be?
In the old days when we were young, a traveler through a country would stop at a village and he didn't have to ask for food or for water. Once he stops, the people give him food, entertain him. That is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it will have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not enrich themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to be able to improve? These are the important things in life. And if one can do that, you have done something very important which will be appreciated.
The open source report on the 21st of May 2019 from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network, as we partner here with Cranston Software, as we have for the last number of years. The title of this episode, Open Source and Huawei. Huawei has been in the news because of new restrictions placed on it by the U.S. government. It has been on various lists that American companies cannot trade with Huawei, and they are forbidden to participate in networks across the 50 continuous states. However, there is a modification there. Huawei, the leader in what is known as G5 technology, they are the leader in the world in that. Thus, their lack of participation in the U.S. market is a blow to the U.S. market. The U.S. is also trying to persuade various European governments to keep Huawei out. Now, the Huawei situation is viewed by the administration as a security precaution. But part of the problem there is that this so-called word security is like in the Iraqi war. The Bush administration stated that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of destruction. These weapons were supposed to be there. They were not there. Now, this was before the age of fake news. The problem is when you put out these types of bulletins as a fact, does Huawei actually pose a threat in terms of their networking equipment? They make networking equipment, incidentally, not only networks, but smartphones. They have their own smartphones. They're the number 2 in the world, and various other electronic appliances, tablets across the board. And they license the Google apps such as Gmail, the Google PlayStation, or not PlayStation, the Google Play app, I guess it's called, that features apps from various developers, independent developers, that is. So that is all rolled into the system. And on top of that, there is the open source part of Android. Now, Android is on Huawei phones, such as same as it was on ZTE. Now, ZTE was another company that the administration labeled a rogue company, and they paid $1 billion fine and were back in. Grace, the problem is when you start using sanctions lists to ban products for no other reason than purely trade reasons, period. you are creating an artificiality. And that in itself, if a nation wants to do that, that is perfectly okay from our perspective at this mic. You can do it. But in a modern global economy, that has effects. And we'll get into the effects that are being seen by the Broadcom and various other chip makers in the U.S. because they supply Huawei with some of the chips that they use. And thus their stocks had dropped. Huawei particular purposes, there is a lesson here that they cannot rely on certain governments there, because these governments have done the same thing that they accuse the people in Beijing of doing. They have state-nized their products. I'm not talking about tariffs here, but in other ways of trying to push their products out. But if you go back to the old textbook on globalization, it was written by a person named Karl Marx. But capitalists always have to be in search of markets. That's the whole idea. And that would be the same thing that you would get from Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. So it's a universal belief that they have to expand. And the expansion in the telecom sector is in places like India, China, other emerging markets across the African continent. Now, this is places where Huawei is there. They make the handsets or the mobile phones. They make the components for the internet services. They are the leader in G5. So thus the U.S. is boxing themselves in. Yes, they can have Verizon here and whomever else that they want to have, but the market is limited here. It's saturated. And how does it affect other products such as Apple? Apple is trying to get into China, trying to get into India. They're there, but they compete with these other manufacturers. And of course, it's Samsung. Will Samsung come under a ban? Well, we don't know at this particular time. They made all kinds of agreements. The Koreans have. But other players are there now, and not only the major hardware players, but in terms of software, there are many, many companies you've not heard of. Period. And this is where the Android open source project comes in, and some of the things that Microsoft is doing also with open source on their Edge browser. We'll get into that. So we'll spend a lot of time in this broadcast talking about open source and where it is today and how it influences business, the Howies of the world, what is going on even in Microsoft with their browser. Their mobile browser this is Microsoft, is basically an open source browser. Why are they using open source? Because it's there. It cuts down on development time and it is sound. And they say that they will donate a code back to the project. As we leave here, we'll hear from Jan Hall. Jan Hall's been around a very, very long time talking about open source. He was there at the beginning of open source. He was speaking at a Linux Fest in the Pacific Northwest, and how he looks at particularly the kernel project and the kernel developers out there and where they stand. Some people have left kernel development, and the reason for that, people are compensated for work there, but these volunteers were not, and they did not want to see their work go up in flames. And because of the corporateness of it, and Jan Hall agrees on that, the idea is that if the open source movement welcomed the IBMs, etc., of the world in, they will sustain the projects. Perhaps and perhaps not. This is economic jiu-jitsu, basically speaking there. So what has happened here, politics, global politics, has more than ever entered the open source movement. Now, at one time, open source was up against proprietary software such as Windows, etc., and that was more of a marketing game. And we still have people at various open source companies that are in the marketing game. But the global situation goes well beyond the quote-unquote ordinary marketing game. Let's get to the program here. We started as usual with Ubuntu and the late Baba Nelson Mandela explaining the concept of Ubuntu. The stable kernel now is 5.1.3. That's the Linux kernel. Now we are running here Slackware, which I believe our kernel is at, let's see, where is our kernel? It is 4.91.49, I believe is where it is. And on the Ubuntu station, we are, 5.1 point something, I'd have to look it up. But those are some of the additions that we run here. We're primarily a Slackware house. We run Ubuntu. Now, Ubuntu is one of these mixed bags out there. A lot of scripting has to go into Ubuntu also. There are some programs such as Skype that are proprietary, but yet we all have on a Slackware Skype also. So, and it's not the proprietary model. So some things are going on here and will continue to appear and disappear. Let's first go to the Huawei story, and we'll come back to the kernel and deal with some security problems that have arisen also. Now, this is from Reuters and out of Mumbai and London both. Time to abandon the Huawei phone. That was what some owners asked after U.S. tech giant Google said it would suspend its business with the top China mobile maker, threatening future access to Gmail, Chrome, and YouTube. Google said on Monday that it would comply with an order by the administration to stop supplying Huawei, meaning it would no longer be able to offer its popular Android apps to buyers of new phones. If you already have it on there, you have it on there. So some commentary from various people here. Buying a new phone to replace another one will be another expense. For me, this is some person talking. He lives in, this is Anthony Chiranga. He lives in Nairobi, Kenya. He bought his Huawei, Y7 for $180 2 weeks ago. Quite a bit of money in Kenya. Emerging economies such as Kenya are, of course, key to Huawei and its future ambitions to sell low to medium price headsets outside of China. India, where Huawei also is, has only a single figure market share. But there is some potential there. Some business type in Mumbai who has been considering upgrading his existing phone, the brand P30. I'm not familiar with the P30, but if Google updates are unavailable for the phone and Google Play and apps such as YouTube are not there, I would want to buy a phone at least for the time being. Wouldn't want to buy it for the time being because things do in fact change. Google team working on the Android operating system told Huawei users in a Twitter account, this is the Android account, it will comply with the U.S. regulations and services like Google Play and security from Google Play protection would keep functioning on your existing device. So the key there is your existing device. Fear not. Will this be settled eventually? Well, very difficult to say. Huawei has its own operating system, and of course they can use the open source operating system also. Now this is from CNBC. The biggest problem here is uncertainty by Mr. Hong. Analysts say the U.S. government's temporary easing of restrictions may bring a little respite to Huawei. The latest development comes on the back of the administration adding Huawei last week to a list of mandated license for state-side companies if they want to do business in China, which has special licenses. The biggest problem for them right now is uncertainty. We have uncertainty with the tariff regimes. Incidentally, we have a program called Numbers Man on that side. It's macroeconomics. You can find it on YouTube, the iHeart system, Stitcher, Spreaker, Tumblr, and various other outlets very easily, as you can find the open source one. Now, Alphabet, that's the parent company of Google, to suspend business with Huawei. Now, this is where the other parts of the ecosystem are channeled come in. Qualcomm, Broadcom. They supply a lot of chips and wireless connections. We have it in a notebook there around. Will not supply Huawei until further notice. The snowball effect started by Google likely will continue on. That is from somebody by the name of Enshel. He said more insights and a strategic development. For its part, Huawei has stood defiant. The company's, of course, founder told the Chinese broadcaster CCTV that the U.S. government actions are at the moment underestimate our capacity. That was according to this transcript. Reen said that Huawei was at odds with the U.S. government and not the firms. I don't necessarily see Huawei changing a course. That is a seg there, period. Huawei's fortunes hit a roadblock. The discussion has shifted to who may stand to benefit here, and some of its rivals, particularly in Korea, according to Daniel Yu, head of global strategies there. So will Samsung turn out well? We'll see. Would be the beneficiary. You said data from CAD analysts that shows Samsung's annual growth in worldwide smartphones declining 10% in Q1 of 2019, while Huawei has surged 50.2%. Well, people, this is all about economics here. We see this, and this is why we went over to this particular description here. And basically from Bloomberg you get the same thing. This is not a financial program, but what we're trying to do here is understand what is going on. Intel also in there with Qualcomm and Broadcom and others told their workers they will not supply to Huawei. Huawei will have to make its own chips, and some chips they are making or have been making themselves. They're dependent on U.S. companies for chips woven into 5G equipment. given the competition capacity of making 5G gear as reliable and inexpensive any impediment to Huawei's production of its equipment could slow the rollouts, no doubt about that, and the adaptation of 5G. Now, this is some of the most exposed suppliers, and some of them Neo Photonic Corporation, they are 49% exposed. And then we get to Quano Inc. at 13. Micron, they make a lot of memory chips out of Utah at 13%. Pfizer Corporation 8.4%. And really down at the is Broadcom at 5.3%. So if you look at this from Bloomberg, they were not as exposed as they possibly could be, and Intel is really not even listed there. But with its processors, and they would go to another processor, modems from many of its smartphones, some of the sellers of programmable chips. And the result of this is financial gets less than 1% of its revenue in that particular deal. Qualcomm, about 2.6% of revenue comes from Qualcomm. And Lumentum Holdings, about 4.8% there. And it cut its forecast. And let's see, Broadcom, their shares, and this is a consequence of proprietary software, 3.7 with 5.3 revenue exposure to them. In Europe, the impact of the ban will also be felt, though companies there are only restricted from supplying research and products made in the U.S., Germany there. So, little different situation there. Huawei is heavily dependent on U.S. silicon conductor products and would be severely crippled without supply of key components. That's according to one analyst. And they figure it'll cause delays in bill-outs. Possibly, but I doubt that it will cause that much of a delay, because some of these 5G networks have already, or the start of laying them out. Now, this 5G, back to 5G and where open source stands here is, it'll be the backbone of a modern economy. And this is the business case, the political case, all rolled into one, the social case of why all of this should be open source. Not only that, it makes the case of software, but also of hardware. And this is something that is coming. The Chinese companies still be able to have access to app security updates that come with open source version of Android. That's what Reuters reported, period. Well, the problem with the Android, if you go to Android to Pi and what have you, those updates on those smartphones are rolled out by the Samsungs, Huawei's, and various other implementers, whether they be T-Mobile or Vodafone or Verizon, etc., on their phones. They put the implementations out there. So this is something to no doubt remember what is actually going on here. Let me go now, transition over here to a problem. This is the Linux kernel RDS flaw affects Red Hat, Ubuntu, Debian, and SUSE. If you're not in the habit of keeping up with updates from the latest versions of the kernel, now you might be a good time to think about doing so. Systems based on versions of the kernel older than 5.8 suffer from a severe flaw in the implementation of RDS over TCP. Let me just skip back here just a minute here. What is RDS? Reliable Datagram Socket. And we got this from a paper here. What is RDS? RDS over TCP usage in the cloud. Because I like to define the terms and not necessarily the acronyms. The datagram socket that guarantees reliable, orderly, and datagram delivery. Applications see send message and datagram semantics. Underline transport. Historically, reliable data socket was motivated by BI use case, and in addition, high bandwidth support, BI, native BI, etc. And various other things with applications. So this is very important. We advise people to update those kernels, period. This is a paper here, and we'll get to who the paper cluster applications using the cloud need to leverage from high-speed Ethernet-based CLOS networks are commonly encountered in data centers. So this is basically where this is going to understand the relationship the next few slides. And we'll get to whom this is by. We won't go any more into this. I'm not sure. I think we will impinge this on. And this is by a person at Oracle. It was written in 2015. And Cloud Open North America, where he presented. Vesharan is his last name. He is at Oracle. This comes from Beta News, but there is of these from a Red Hat. A flaw was found in the Linux kernel implementation of RDS over TCP, a system that has the RDS TCP kernel modular loaded either through autoload via process running listen or manually loaded. Could possibly cause a user after free UAF in which the attacker who is able to manipulate the socket state while the network's nameplate is being torn down. From Ubuntu, however, yet to see evidence to support the allegation this is a remotely exploitable. Blacklisting to the modular is probably sufficient. That's the RDS. The default configuration of the K-mode package has included RDS. It's in the Mode Pro, in other words, that's in a module. There, the problem has a patch in version 5.0.8 kernel anyway. And I believe that is our Ubuntu kernel that we are using. And this is more on to Red Hat and the explanation of what is going on here. 2019 11815 technical types. And the affected code is not built in the following kernels. This would be Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7, Red Hat Enterprise Linux MRG2, and another enterprise there, the ARM version of the Linux kernel. That's Red Hat Linux 8. And I believe this is obviously from Ubuntu. This is before, as far as Ubuntu is concerned, before 5.08. And after that, you really do not need to worry. But you do need, in fact, to upgrade that particular kernel. Now let's go to Microsoft Edge, making the browser better through more open source collaboration. This is the Microsoft blog. And we got a date. Oh, well, actually, this was 2018. So they've been in this process for a long time. Today we're announcing that we intend to adopt Chromium open source project in the development of Microsoft Edge. And they've already done this in the mobile portion of it. Let me now this is ZDNet here. Joanne Foley, she writes all the time. This is on May the 20th. Making it official on May the 20th, the first preview of bill of Chromium-based Edge. This is for the Mac OS. The release follows by a month of the first official release, Chromium-based Edge Canary, and developers preview that was for Windows 10. Now you start to see the cross-platformization of these various OS's present roadmaps. You're going to see more and more open source product in implementations, I should say, various Windows products, including Windows 10. And part of the reason for this is the cloud. The cloud is primarily an open source platform, and this affects how things are proprietary. We should say things is not a very good term. Are actually presented to the consumer and business audience. And as we warp more and more to an open source presentation, and you'll hear from Jean Hall later here about the history of the Linux kernel, history of open source software, Libre software, you're going to see more of a transition to it, because primarily development costs has brought it in, and also the increased reliance on data center centric applications, or cloud, or whatever you want to call them. And when you start talking about Android, later Fuchsia, and the Mac OS, or whatever other OS you're talking about, a Linux desktop, they will all effectively be the same on the mobile devices. Very little difference in them. And this is where this whole trade debacle with Huawei is occurring about markets. And when you start talking about the emerging markets, the primary targets are much younger people. And if these established companies in the U.S. and wherever else just target the audiences that they have, which are becoming less and less in terms of demographics. In the U.S., as the baby boomers, which I'm one, start to disappear from the landscape in the next 10-20 years, they'll be replaced by a different generation. And where does this put some of the existing companies? Well, many of them will be out of the business, as Warren Buffett said at his conference there, Berkshire Hathaway. But the newspapers, as we see them today, are toast. Well, many other things are going to be toast also. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it would be unimaginable that Microsoft would have an open source browser. They had Internet, what was it, Explorer, what the hell it was, for a very, very long time. It was crap to begin with. But now it is totally different. And where does that put Mac OS? Well, Mac OS is proprietary, riding on the free version of Unix, built upon it, we'll say. And with the Microsoft browser, they'll be available on Windows 7, 8.1, and 10, while Edge will continue to ship with Windows 10. Microsoft will update it independently of the operating system on which it runs. and patch more frequently than non-Chromium-based browser types. They're getting out of the Chromium browser, the Chromium operating system is much better. So this is the official Microsoft blog here. And how does that affect other Microsoft Pros? Well, we'll have to wait and see on those. Now, this is from Tech Republic. We basically, this was when Huawei, before this happened, developed its own OS as a continuously plan. Well, they need it right now with U.S. sanctions and what have you. They began this development in 2012, if I can count correctly. That was 7 years ago. The ability to distribute Android there early this year. ZTE's operation came to a grinding halt. We talked about the denial of export privileges. ZTE paid a $1 billion bribe, and now they're back. Incidentally, ZTE has very good phones. Because of the core Android is open source, we talked about that previously. It may not be possible, it is not possible to prevent Huawei from using it. However, Huawei could be banned from using a Google Play for what it's worth. And we won't rehash some of this, but in December the 3rd, 2008, incidentally on the 23rd, there's a live stream of Data and Tech from Longevity. It's an introduction in Data and Tech from Longevity. And this is by Shah Amin, a data specialist. They are in Chicago, but it is free, and we'll put a link hopefully on this. We remember it, we'll get it done. Let me see what else we can conjure up here. Oh yeah, AMD just scored a huge Ryzen Pro win. Lenovo ThinkPads, their successor to IBM, has been lagging behind. No doubt with AMD trying to win OEM. Lenovo is giving AMD a much needed boost against Intel. Second generation Ryzen processor to the brand new T and X series ThinkPads. ThinkPads are very good. They're a little expensive. These are some of the ThinkPads out there. The Pro, let's see, what's it called? 3700U processor there, and I'm not sure what about it. They will be though on ThinkPads. Let's see, a little tidbit here this is from Nativo's representatives. Longer battery life in AMD's second gen processor. It expects an AMD powered to last 45 minutes to 1 hour less than the Intel, this Whiskey Lake there, counterpart when running on battery. The trade-off, of course, is higher graphics capacity. We use AMD here and have used AMD for over 20 years. AMD is much better with graphics, and they've become much better today. They will start to ship a little pricey, sub $1,000 range. What is it, $939? They'll come down, and the other one, the T495S, started roughly $1,000. So that is one of the rollouts to look at if you're in the market for a standard computer. That's a little bit here. I guess we'll throw this in. If you've been following Linux, IBM, and Red Hat since Linux Torvalds was a graduate student. IBM, I remember when they put the $1 billion in, and they have now acquired a Red Hat. And according to this columnist here, Stephen Vaughn. Anyway, his belief is that IBM's CEO, that's Jenny Remedy, has said in a conversation with Red Hat CEO Whitehurst, I don't have deft mesh for $330 billion. I'm not buying them to destroy them. It's a win for our clients. Well, the reason they bought Red Hat to begin with, IBM had been in trouble as far as the cloud, and they're up against the competition of Microsoft, the Google Cloud, and they need fresh blood. And of course, they obviously lag behind Amazon Web Services, which are trying to get ahead of the ball game. In fact, they now have StatCast, that's in Major League Baseball. You see them all around, so they're advertising to businesses. But IBM primarily is a service-oriented company. IBM Global Services. We've been an IBM developer for a very long time, and still dabble but not sell in their partners channel, which is Shrink. And down there, we have the lowest possible membership, and I need to check that out. There are various under the IBM partners, not as much as before that you are. So we're the lowest grade. But a developer's channel, it used to be that IBM, more than anyone else, offered much more technical information to its developers than anyone, and it still does to a certain extent. They used to actually even offer free software out there. They don't do that anymore. You have to buy it. I think it's about $1,500 the last time that I checked on it. Anyway, that is IBM's story here, and Red Hat will be able to tap IBM's Salesforce, no doubt. That will give them reach into large enterprise type of operations. Their business is commercializing open source. They can now tap into IBM's research for more projects to become open source and have first track of commercialization. I am assured that they can also access financing on an IBM scale. Now that was from Tom Petroselli. He's a research fellow, Amalgam Insights. So that statement, is that better for open source or not better for open source? Well, effectively what you have is a commercial enterprise that's taken over Red Hat, but Red Hat had already commercialized through their enterprise editions, although they contribute to open source. Now the question begs, these collaborations, Jan Hall will talk about them, are very similar to ideas on the political scene of government private partnerships. And we talk about that on our political channel, Boston Red. And we do not favor those, because what happens is the private part of the equation wins out over the public part. In many projects, in fact, the present administration on their infrastructure project wanted to do massive public-private endeavors, but it has since been dropped. Now, from a sheer economic standpoint, will these public-private collaborations continue? Well, we predict not as much in the future, primarily because of cost. Now, this is what is driving open source against proprietary software, and proprietary software will start to disappear from the landscape, but not completely. And this is a good example of what happened with Red Hat. Canonical, that is Ubuntu, is next. They've already went into some proprietary software, not as much as they did at one time. And they have a cloud there. Will they be bought by someone? Quite possible out there, and they'd be a willing person to sell out their product. But the key to open source liberated development is more development. And this so-called worst case scenario is bared out by what happened to and is happening to Huawei. We have to look at it in a very serious vein. Let me just check on our time here, and we'll go to Jan Hall in the edited version of his presentation at Linux Fest Northwest. That was earlier this month there, and we'll hear from him. So in our broadcast, this is MA in the Jerry Pippin broadcast booth, the open source report on the 21st of May 2019. Huawei and the future of open source. That is the title of our episode. Good day.
Computers, high-performance computers, were first developed in 1994, and a lot of the major distributions happened. It's 30 years of the World Wide Web, yes? Tim Berners-Lee in 1989 developed the idea of the World Wide Web at CERN. It took a couple years for it to catch on, but took off. And the infamous Unix license plate that was developed at Digital Equipment Corporation so that everybody could have the Unix license has been going on for 30 years. I have had the real Unix license plate on my car for 30 years in New Hampshire. And I keep getting all these tickets from Texas and California and stuff from people that have the fake license plates on their car. Please stop it. However, 50 years ago, Unix started. And a whole bunch of other things happened at that half-century mark. People walked on the moon. The whole world came to a halt the day that people stepped out on the moon. And people all over the world were huddled in front of TV sets to see that. Woodstock happened, big music festival. Everybody, start of a lot of the bands that the older people really like. In New York City, the Stonewall Inn had a riot. A bunch of what we call dykes, men dressed up as women, happened, and it started the LGBTQ movement in the USA. In Bell Labs in New Jersey, two people, Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, started the Unix operating system. They were researchers. It was just for fun, just for research. They didn't expect it was going to have any big impact on the world. And we'll go through a little bit of the history of that and why it was important. The ARPANET started. The basis of the Internet started in 1969. And it was started the way that God and Al Gore expected it to go. So that was great. Linus Torvalds was born in 1969. Yes, he is 50 years old, which makes me feel incredibly old, right? Because I remember him as a 23-year-old college student. And 50 years ago was the last time I ever shaved. Oh, and also the first time I ever wrote a program. So in the beginning, computers were, of course, physically huge. They might cost $2.5 million. They would easily take up a room this size. You would have very large disk drives and things like that. However, they were logically small. You could measure their memory oftentimes in kilobytes. In fact, for a long period of time, the term byte was not actually fixed. There were 5-bit bytes, 6-bit bytes, 8-bit bytes. And a lot of computers were designated in words. It was a 36-bit word machine or a 32-bit word machine. Disks were measured in megabytes. I remember even in 1983, we fought to get a 5 megabyte Winchester drive, which is about this big, and it would cost lots of thousands of dollars. I forget how much it was, but we would fight to get that, or even fight to get harder to get a 10 megabyte disk drive. There was lots of lights on computers and switches on computers because you only ran one program at a time. You may not even have an operating system. In a lot of ways, the mainframe computers were a lot like embedded systems of today. Folks, there's still plenty of chairs down here. You don't have to stand if you don't want to. And if there was an operating system, it was typically very specialized. Specialized to do one thing: time sharing, or real time, or batch, or an educational system, or a hospital system. Now, there's a kind of an urban legend about how all the companies create these different operating systems with different interfaces because they want to lock their customers in and make sure their customers could not go to another company. I worked for a lot of companies back in those days. I don't ever remember that conversation happening. What I do remember is a bunch of engineers and product managers trying to figure out the best way to create an operating system that would help their customers use these incredibly expensive, horribly small, horribly slow machines in the best possible way. And if what we were trying to do was simply lock our customers into using our hardware and software, we could have done that with one operating system on each piece of hardware. Instead, a machine like the PDP-11 had 11 different operating systems on it. RT11 for real-time, RSX11 for a combination of real-time and time sharing. Ristus was an educational system, really nice because it used BASIC as its primary language. There was all these different operating systems for specialized needs. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about the environment back in those days. When I started off in programming, going to Drexel Institute of Technology that later became Drexel University, there were very few professional programmers. If you were interested in computers, you were a physicist and you wrote programs to help you with your physics. You were a chemist and you wrote programs to help you with your chemistry. You were a mathematician and you wrote programs to help you do math. You did not write programs for other people, per se. And there was no such thing as a professional programmer. So, in fact, I had a professor one time that towards the end of my time at Drexel said to me, "John, you will never earn a living as a professional programmer." And 50 years later, I'm still waiting to find out if he was right. There were no software copyrights or patents. Those didn't even show up until around 1986, right? And actually, the first time that software copyrights were actually applied was on ROMs for games, where the game manufacturers would make their ROM, put it into their game, and a bunch of people would come along, rip the ROM out, copy it, and make their own games. And so the government said, no, we have to do something to help this, and software copyrights came in. And patents actually followed that. The patents were even harder to get. No, the way that you protected your software back in those days, if you wanted to, was through contract law. So I would see somebody would have a commercial compiler that I might have to pay $100,000 for. I would contact them. We would start negotiation between our lawyers and their lawyers. How many machines you want to put this on? How are you going to use it? And what type of support you want to have with it? All of this would go into a contract that eventually would be signed. And then a couple weeks later, this person would show up with a magnetic tape. That was an engineer with a magnetic tape. And the magnetic tape had the source code on it for the compiler. And they put that on your machine, and they assembled the compiler, and then they compiled the compiler. Then they ran a series of tests to make sure that the compiler was working properly on your machine. It took about a week. And then the person would leave. But then, if you were a very large insurance company, you would say, you're going to leave that tape with us. Because in case something happens to your company, we need that tape to replicate what you have done. And sometimes that went into some type of escrow in a lawyer's office or things like that. But that's the way you bought software back in 1969. Okay. But there were a lot of people who just wrote the software and then gave it away. And these were the physicists, the chemists, the educators, the things like that. They belonged to user groups like the Digital Equipment Corporation User Society, DECUS, or Share from IBM, or Brainstorm from Novell. And you also had dial-up bulletin boards you could load your software up to. I was a student in 1969. I did not have $100,000 to pay for a compiler. In fact, I struggled to get $10. Okay, but DECUS had a software library, and you could send away for a paper catalog that they would give you, and you would look down all of the different programs for different machines you have, and you say, oh, there's a great text editor. It cost me $5 for the paper tape for it. Well, $5 was a lot of money to a college student back in those days, because for $5 you could buy 10 pitchers of beer. And so I was stuck. Text editor, 10 pitchers of beer. I think you can see what direction I would normally go, right? But this was the equivalent of free software. There was no copyright on it. There was no patent. In fact, the people had contributed their software to DECUS so that other people could use it. So I would go to the school store, get some blank paper tape, stick it through my ASR 33 teletype, make copies of the text editor, and sell it to my roommates for $1 a copy. And by the time I'd made the 10 copies, I had both my text editor and my 10 pitchers of beer. I was the first Red Hat. And we had user groups and we talked things back and forth, and DECUS would have yearly meetings, sometimes attracting as many as 19,000 people twice a year to their conferences so that they could learn more about and how to use these wonderfully expensive, slow computing systems that we have back then. Well, that's all background for Unix. Because Ken Thompson had been working on a project called Multics with a bunch of other companies, and he was pulled back from that project by AT&T because they were worried that, the government might think that the telephone company was getting into computing, and God knows that computing has nothing to do with telephony, okay? So Ken was pulled back to Bell Labs in New Jersey, and he really loves working on operating systems. So he finds a cast-off PDP-7 sitting in the hallway, and he convinces this other guy named Dennis Ritchie to come in. Let's build this little operating system just for fun called, well, they named it eventually Unix, where Multics was everything for everybody. Unix was something for one person. And they wanted to do a small kernel, very, very low amount of information in it, or functionality in it. It made it easier to get it right. They wrote it in machine language. In fact, they didn't even have an assembler that fit on the PDP-7. Its memory was too small. So they went to another computer, used a cross assembler to build the program, took the paper tape over to the PDP-7, loaded it in with the ASR 33 teletype. By the way, that read about 5 characters per second. Ka-chunka, 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 right? Read it in, started it up, and of course immediately it would crash. And that's where the lights and switches come in. So you use the lights and switches to set your addresses and look at all the values through memory and all the registers and everything to figure out why this thing crashed. And then you go back to the other machine, you make your changes, make the tape again, and go back. And they kept doing this and doing this. And eventually they got to work on the PDP-7. But about that time, the PDP-7 kind of ran out of steam. It was too small, too slow. So they wanted to get a much newer, faster machine called a PDP-11. Now, when I say much larger, it's 64K address space, okay? But there's cheating there because 64K of data and 64K of instructions, and 64K of system space and 64K of user space. So it's fairly large compared to the PDP-7. But they didn't have any money for this. I mean, the PDP-7 was out in the hallway. Nobody was using it. Everybody wanted a PDP-11. So they couldn't get the money. Their department said, no, we're not going to. So they went to the only department inside of AT&T that had almost unlimited money. Which department was that? Legal. Somebody said it. Okay, legal. Yes. The lawyers. And these guys convinced them that they would make a machine that the lawyers could do all of their legal briefs on it. So I'm going to put this image in your mind. A lawyer sitting down and using a dot editor, ED, to write TROF and NROF code and packages. And that's why we invented a really intelligent type of person called legal secretary. Mostly women. And these women would eventually end up writing their own shell scripts and having their own databases and things like that. Very impressive. So so now they had the PDP-11, but they had to rewrite the kernel again because, of course, the assembly language or machine language of the PDP-11 was completely different than the PDP-7. So they wrote it again, and they got it working on the PDP-11. And about this time, Dennis says, this is too much like work. I'm going to write this language called C, and we can rewrite the kernel again in C, and then we'll never have to write it again because it'll be done. Except when we went to an Interdata 832, it had a completely different structure. So now we find out that there's parts of the kernel that are independent of the architecture, the scheduling and the memory, the upper scale memory management, things like that. And then there's the stuff that's lower down that really is architecture dependent. And so they started changing the kernel to do this and making the kernel more and more portable. Now, why is this interesting? Because the PDP-11 wasn't that fast. And what they're doing actually is making the hardware, making the operating system maybe a little less efficient. But it's the same operating system with the same commands across all these different pieces of hardware. Because remember, up to that point, the vendors were all saying, we're going to make the operating system to make the computer efficient. Oh, you just have to retrain all of your employees. Tough. Too bad. Now they were saying, humans are actually pretty expensive and machines are getting cheaper and faster. Maybe we should do something to make the humans more productive and not have to retrain going across all of this. So the other thing that was happening at this time was that Ken loved to go on sabbatical, loved to teach at universities, and he would go around with his tape underneath his arm to these different universities like Carnegie Mellon, MIT, and most famously, University of California, Berkeley, to teach the students how to do operating system design. And these universities would start contributing stuff back to this project of Unix. And in fact, Berkeley went off on their own little trail to do their own version of Unix, which became known as BSD, the Berkeley Software Distribution. Even governments and companies would get this copy of Unix and contribute back to it. However, it was not free. If you are a research university, you could get a license, I think it was $350 for a site-wide source code license so that you could use it in all of your machines. But if you were teaching in a small 2-year technical college called Hartford State Tech, that was not a research university. And if you wanted a copy of Unix, first of all, you had to find the person inside of AT&T who would sell it to you, and then you would pay $160,000 per CPU, and you had to tell them what the serial number of that CPU was. Now, how many of you know the serial number of your laptop? Slackers. I actually tried to get it. I didn't have $160,000. I couldn't get it. And that was too bad. I would have loved to have showed my students the source code. Oh, I'm sorry. That's illegal. If you look at the fine, smudgy little print down in your contract, you're not allowed to show the students the source code. And this brought about a crisis a few years later, where the students were now graduating, and AT&T would come along and say, "Oh, did you see our source code? Oh, you're contaminated. You can't go and work with any operating system any other place." This didn't go over well. I still have the button to say, "Get your lawyers off of my computer." There were other contributions of the Unix system, though. How many of you know a person by the name of Doug McElroy? You should. You should know Doug. He was the actual director of the laboratory. He hired Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie into Bell Labs. He was the person who first conceived of the concept of pipes and filters. And he had to write some of the first Unix commands, some of the simple ones like spell and and cat and ls and stuff, so he could show Ken and Dennis how all these things fit together on this thing called the pipeline. And Doug is a really great guy, very humble, a very, very interesting person. But that was another contribution. And the shell, as a separate program that you could just replace with another shell, or no shell if you want to, was another interesting concept that came out of Unix. Portable network file systems. I still remember the year of the network file system, RFS, NFS, and all these FSs. We finally settled, for better or worse, with NFS, probably worse. And then other things that came out, MIT with Project Athena, the X Windows system, and Kerberos, a network-based security system, and many, many, many more contributions that were either developed on top of Unix or made specially because of Unix. But then became the beginning of the end. A little company called Sun Microsystems had this really nice little computer board that they had designed at Stanford, and they were looking for an operating system to put on it. And they went around looking at different operating systems. CP/M was just nowhere near powerful enough for this. They actually came to DEC, wanted to get VMS. We kind of laughed at them and said, and that was probably good for them not to try and put VMS on that. But they finally went to University of California, Berkeley, said, "Hey, we want to put Berkeley Unix on that." And there was this guy named Bill Joy that came there to Sun to help them do that. You also know Bill Joy from writing VI, if you're a VI or Vim person. And so now they had their operating system, but they couldn't spend $160,000 per machine and to tell the serial number. So they went to AT&T and they negotiated a license. I think it was about $350 for an unlimited number of people on top of this little board. But it could only be binary. And you didn't have to tell anybody your serial number. That was good. You also had a 2-user license that you could buy a little bit cheaper, or the unlimited license. And people say, well, why do you have a 2-user license? Why not a single-user license? Well, you want a 2-user license so that UUCP can log in to your system and transmit information, or the person who's root can come in and reboot your system or figure out what's going on while you're doing it. So that's why you needed 2 users and not just one. Other companies started to follow this. Now, up until this point, Digital had been supporting Unix just by fixing the hardware and helping the Unix people put their Unix systems on Digital's equipment, but we started to bring out our own Unix system. Most of these were BSD-oriented. Why? Well, System 5, at that time I think it was actually System 3, was still a swapping virtual memory subsystem. And so it was limited as to how large your programs could be. They only supplied 2 compilers, a C compiler and Fortran 77, And they had UUCP, which is a store and forward networking system that would actually call up your modem and log in and transfer the information and so forth and so on. BSD had demand page virtual memory, which allowed a program of almost unlimited size in those days. They had 3 compilers, C, Fortran, and Pascal, but most importantly, in a lot of ways, they had already implemented TCP/IP. And with System 5, or the Unix from the AT&T, you had to go off and buy a TCP/IP implementation from a company called Wollongong if you wanted to have that on your computer. So most of the companies went with a BSD license. Now, what was the bad thing about that was the fact that the University of California, Berkeley had no advertising money to say, buy BSD, right? This is the problem of Linux systems today. We have very little advertising money. But AT&T had a huge amount of money that they would buy the 2-page spread in Computer World every week to say System 5 the right choice. It's a little bit like Microsoft and other companies. Now, there was one person who was a little bit upset about this problem of these binary-only systems, and that was a person named Richard Stallman, who in 1983 announced the GNU project, which GNU is not Unix. And he wanted to create a complete operating system with the source code available, and he started off with a thing called Emacs, a text editor. And a lot of people said, you could have stopped with Emacs because it does everything an operating system does. It schedules tasks, it schedules memory, it handles I/O, it does everything. But he went on and he did a compiler suite that worked across different operating systems. Now, what was really particularly brilliant about this? I mean, he could have started by trying to write a kernel. But if he did, there would have been nothing to run on it. So instead, he started writing code that worked across all these different operating systems, which attracted people that saw his vision of having this one set of tools and operating system that would run across all this hardware. In 1985, he started the Free Software Foundation to try and systematize this and to create this and go forward. He wanted people and first to be portable across all these different operating systems. And this also allowed a bunch of small companies to start up. Companies like Primetime Software, who would take a lot of this code and put it on CDs because people didn't have internet going to their homes, and even then the internet that existed was relatively slow. And people like Jim Joyce, who would have his Unix bookstore at little, Unix meetings and stuff around the world. And eventually, O'Reilly started up with books and everything, and started a whole mechanism of writing these books that showed people how to use Unix. There were also companies like Cygnus, who started up to supply support, commercial support, to the compiler suite for companies like Boeing. Now, this was interesting because commercial compilers would typically generate code that would run 30, 40, or 50% faster than the fledgling GCC compilers, or the fledgling GNU compilers. But why would Boeing use that? Well, number one, they didn't have to pay outrageous prices for the compilers that did that. But number two, each one of those compilers, as much as the companies tried to make them standard, they didn't run on all the different systems. That was the first problem. And the systems, when you went to a different compiler made by a different vendor on a different system, there were tiny little changes or differences in the syntax and the semantics of the compiler, which caused you, the application programmer, to have to put if-defs into your code to get around those changes. And the more if-defs you put into the code, the more testing you had to do as you go across all these platforms, because you had to go through every single path of your code to do extensive testing. So Boeing, that was forced by government contracts to use different computers and different operating systems from different companies, had all these different compilers, and their code had huge amounts of if-defs in them. By using the GCC compilers, they were able to eliminate large numbers of these if-defs in their code and make their code faster, easier to test, and more sure of working. And Cygnus sold support to Boeing and then later on other companies to do this. Now, about this time, 1983, Digital Equipment Corporation was looking at all of this, and we decided to come out with our own the weather comes in, we missed a window, sorry guys, take them out of the capsule, unload the capsule with all the fuel because the window is passed and it is too late. Why did they do this? Because they couldn't predict the weather with 100% accuracy. They knew how to do it, but the problem was it took so much time to collect the data, so much time to process the data to find out what the weather was going to be. So, if you want to know what the weather's going to be 24 hours in advance, but it takes you 48 hours to collect the data and process it, that means you know exactly what the weather was 24 hours ago. So you speed up the process. Now it takes 24 hours to gather and process the data to tell you what the weather is going to be 24 hours in advance. You know what the weather is right now. If you keep going faster and faster, you finally can get to the point where you start collecting the data and processing it, and now you know exactly what the weather is going to be 12 hours in advance. You know, don't put the astronauts up in the capsule. Okay? And that's why for the last umpty-ump years, there hasn't been a case where we said we're going to stop the launch because of weather, because we can predict the weather with 100%. We can predict, in Japan, we can predict earthquakes 100% accurately 30 seconds in advance. And people say, mad dog, what use is that? You're old, you can't even run to the door in 30 seconds, right? No, I can't. But the thing is that most of the damage in earthquakes is caused by firestorms, gas mains breaking, electrical wires dropping, sparks happening, fires are created. And if you know 30 seconds in advance, you can turn off all the gas mains, you can turn off the electricity until the earthquake is over, and then systematically turn it back on. You can lower the gate to keep the cars off the bridge, let the cars that are on the bridge get off the bridge before the earthquake hits. These are the things you could do if you know about it. And if you have enough computing power, you can do this calculation for every 30 seconds. So they knew that if they could break down these problems, and fluid dynamics problems are very good broken down, easily decomposed, that they could solve a lot of these problems that they knew how to solve. They simply couldn't afford to solve. And by using commodity-style computers, they could reduce the price to 1/40th of what it had been with regular supercomputers. Or looking at it another way, get 40 times the computing power for the same amount of money. And that's why all 500 supercomputers in the world currently run Linux. Used to be only 498 ran them, because 2 of them ran Microsoft. I believe that's because Microsoft paid them to run Microsoft. But recently they gave up. All 500 of them run Linux. And it's basically the same Linux kernel that you have on your laptop or your desktop. Now, I inadvertently influenced this because we had just ported Linux to the alpha, and I had a whole bunch of CDs that actually had Intel software of the same version as the alpha version, that I was going around the world handing these out like Johnny Linux Seed. And I gave one of these to a student at the University of Hawaii, and he looked at it and says, yeah, that's kind of interesting. My father's an ISP. Thank you. 4 years later, this student was at Los Alamos Laboratory, had put together a Beowulf system called Loki, and was using it to simulate asteroids crashing into the Earth to see what type of damage they were doing. For a while, he was making them crash into New York City, but after 9/11, he used Los Angeles. His name was Pat Goda, and that's a picture of Pat standing in front of Loki right there. When I called him up, because I was writing for a Linux journal at the time, I called him up to write an article about this. He says, "You don't remember who I am, do you?" I says, "No." He says, "I'm the kid at the University of Hawaii that you gave that CD to. And because you gave me that CD of Red Hat software, that's why all the national labs use Red Hat for their systems." They stopped doing that because, unfortunately, Red Hat started to charge on a per CPU basis for support. That just wouldn't work, so they blew that one. And today, all the high-performance computing systems, the 500 fastest computers in the world, run Linux. Now, for the last several years, maybe for the last 20 years, we've always talked about the year of the Linux desktop. This is going to be the year of the Linux desktop. And because and why this is so hard to do was because for a long time there was only one standard, and that was DOS Windows. I mean, I remember my father sitting in front of his Windows computer with his paper notebook, writing down each and everything that he was supposed to type in. You know, when you see this word, you type in this word. When you see this window come up, you type in this. And that's how they did it. But this was somewhat broken as browsers started to come out, because browsers would change without you installing new software. You know, the browser would come up and the whole page would be different. Whoa, that's not in my notebook. And cell phones also broke this, so people now had to start thinking about the interface is, what does it mean when this thing comes up, and how do I react to it? So this has kind of broken that older standard. One of the reasons why the Linux desktop didn't work as well as we would hope it would was because of lack of games. Now, I'm not a gamer. I don't play games. I'm sorry. I've never played games. I don't play board games either.
I got text games.
Adventure I played twice. But now that's beginning to change because there are some games that are starting to happen for Linux systems, and that's great. That's wonderful. But the other thing is, when you buy a system, you always look for those 5 applications. All you want is 5 applications. You know, a decent Office package, a music player, so. And the first couple, they weren't hard to find. They would happen. The third one was a little harder to find. The fourth one was almost impossible to find. And that fifth one was really, really horrible. Now, the reason for that was you had a different fifth one than you did. And you had a different fifth one than these two guys had. And you had a different fifth one than those had. Nobody could get that fifth application. But again, the web is changing this. Okay? And so we keep getting closer and closer to having a Linux desktop. And more, now about 10% of the systems in the world on the desktop are running Linux. And I believe that as the third world comes in, the people that can't afford to pay what most people call the Microsoft tax, there will be more and more Linux systems on them.
Or those who don't want the NSA reading those.
The lady said, or those who don't want the NSA on them. You're getting very close to what WIT is doing. So in 1999, I had some friends of mine who started up the Linux terminal server program. And basically what this allowed you was to use these Linux systems on these cheap or old computers to attach to whatever system you wanted and use it as a very powerful and easy-to-use terminal. Another threat to free software is Apple. And I have to give it to Steve Jobs. He was probably the first computer person who said, computers aren't just for computer people anymore. They're actually for consumers. And I talked to you before about the size differences between the scientific market and the commercial market. The consumer market dwarfs both of them by many times. So when he started creating things like the iPad, it's not a computer, it's an appliance like your toaster, right? You just use it. And he took FreeBSD and hid it under a whole bunch of graphics. Unfortunately for Apple, Google and Android kind of foiled their plan of world domination of phones. And the reason that this happened is if you look back in the old days where Apple had 7% of the desktop market, they concentrated on people who were artists. They concentrated on education. And so they got that 7% of the market, and it was profitable for them. The rest of the market, but they had a stack. They created the hardware and the software, and they controlled the applications, and so they had this stack. And if you wanted to make money with Apple, you had to be Apple. The only people that made money with Apple was Apple. You had an Apple printer, you had an Apple disk, you had an Apple monitor, you had an Apple everything. Versus Microsoft said, if you could even say the word Windows, you could put our software on your hardware. And so all the other hardware people in the world went with Microsoft, and that's why 90% of the market was Microsoft. Trick question. What is a PC store? You know, a personal computer store. What does a personal computer store actually sell? Hardware. Nah. Shelf space. They have a certain amount of shelf space, and what they want to sell is when you walk in that store, you find what you want as quickly as you want, you take it up to the front. If you have to ask a single question, that's too much. And that's why in most PC stores, the person who knows about PCs has been replaced by somebody who says, can I help you carry this thing to the front of the store? It's shelf space. It's what grocery stores sell. That's why all of your high-priced must-do stuff is up on the front of the store, but the milk is at the back of the store because they know you're going to walk back there for the milk. And while you do, you have to walk past all these other things on the shelf space. And so you want stuff on that shelf that's going to sell really fast or have a really high margin. And most of the time, it's selling really fast. And that's why most of the PC stores would have the small Apple Center at the back of the store, because the people that wanted Apple, they're going to walk all the way back there. But at the front of the store, and the majority of the store, is Microsoft PC stuff. Right? So the same, Apple tried to do the same thing with phones, and Google came in and said, no, if you could even say the word Android, you could put Android on top of your phone, and we'll help you. Which means that all these other hardware people will help to push and make Android successful. And that's why in the future, I predict that Android will have 90% of the market, Apple will have a very profitable 7% of the market, and they'll be very happy, and their shareholders will be very happy. And now we have the cloud, where it's another opportunity for companies to hide the operating system, to hide the applications from the people, and you simply use them. The United States pirates 35% of its desktop software. Brazil pirates 84% of its desktop software. So I go down to Brazil and I say, hey, you should be using free software. And they say, oh, Mad Dog, all of our software is free. Which takes us back to the games. Why haven't games really taken off on Linux? It's because 99% of game software is pirated, right? So if you create a game and you're going to port it to an operating system, it only has 3% of the desktop space, and 99% of the people who are used to using free software are going to pirate it from you. Where is your profit coming? So instead, the first people you port to are the people who have 90% of the desktop space and are used to paying for all of their software, and are used to getting it in binary-only form. And then you might port to Apple with 7% of the desktop, because their people are really used to paying for it. And if you like Linux things, you might do that port too. So the cloud allows people to hide this stuff even better, and you get to lease the software to them. They now literally pay for it forever. Isn't that great? And you give the illusion of privacy. Oh yeah, we'll protect your privacy. We'll do the backups for you and stuff like that, until they don't. And I should have had a long string of asterisks after the NSA. If you ever get me out in a bar, start talking to me about them. We need to take back the cloud. So the summary of history at this point is that Unix created portable code and portable people, and set the APIs for a lot of operating systems of the future. And through POSIX and other standards, even proprietary operating systems now support Unix standards and Unix APIs. GNU Linux relit this. Unix was dying. I was there. It was dying. Microsoft was this onslaught. And GNU Linux, through Richard Stallman, the Free Software Foundation, BSD, a whole bunch of different people, but mostly Linux, relit that. A lot of people ask me, why didn't BSD, that was coming out of its issues of legality and stuff, why didn't it take off like Linux?
2 years late.
2 years late, but another reason.
Expensive.
No, BSDs were free. This is why. The BSD had, as its symbol, this demon with tennis shoes on and smiley face. But let me tell you something. If you had it on your T-shirt driving through Texas, you had problems, right? And most of the BSD people, and I don't mean to insult them or anything, but they had these really long black beards. They looked a little bit satanic themselves. And you compete that with this nice young man with the sandy brown hair with wire-rimmed glasses who spoke this lilting, perfect English with this lilting European accent coming from Helsinki, Finland, of all god-awful places. I mean, Finland has nothing about technology. Forget Nokia. No, and it was just a perfect story for the press. Fortune magazine, Linux on the front with all these sunflowers and, all this stuff that was happening. It was just great. And it was it. Because it's marketing. If it's technology that actually sells something, Microsoft would still be waiting to sell their first copy. It's marketing. It's the story. It's creating a channel so that other people can make money off of what you're doing. In the early days of Linux, there were a bunch of people who said, I don't like that these companies are now making money off the software I write for free. And there's a lot of people that left the Linux kernel project because of that. But there were a couple people, Dave Miller, Alan Cox, Linus himself, who realized, and me, who realized that if you try and stop people from making money with Linux, then they will fight you. But if you allow them to make money with Linux, then they will support you, and you'll go forward. And that leads to the last bullet on this slide, which is a lot of my managers laughed at me when I talked about Linux. And because they said, you should be pushing digital Unix. It's what pays your salary, da-da-da-da. They laughed at me about Linux. And now all of those people work for IBM. And actually, IBM was one of the first large companies, other than me at DEC. It wasn't DEC that really looked at Linux. It was me and a couple of other people. But IBM looked at Linux and saw the future. If you remember, IBM used to produce laptops and desktops and low-end servers. They cannot produce those anymore because the profit margin is too low to allow them to recover the costs of development. And so they sold that off to Lenovo. At the same time, they embraced free software. And at the same time, they doubled the size of the professional services group to sell solutions. When was the last time, except for Watson, that IBM ever mentioned hardware? Ever. Or software. They've never said anything about software. Never. It's always business solutions. Because in that marketplace, you can usually generate a 19% profit margin, which is enough to sustain them. And one of the things I have for you folks, particularly the younger people, if you are interested in making a living with free software or even software of any type, think about a solutions type of business, helping people solve their problem. How many of you have a piece of hardware glued to your wall with a candle on either side like a shrine? Steve Wozniak isn't here. How many of you have a box of software glued to your wall with the candles? Larry isn't here either. Because people don't buy hardware and software. They buy a solution to a problem. And even if what you want to do is to simply play a game, that's what you want to do. If you could play that game with 2 tin cans and a string, you would. It's the problem that people are trying to solve. It's the problem that they will pay you for. In reality, most of the time, almost 100% of the time, you can solve that problem better with free software than you do with closed source software. So in the future, we're going to have users that don't really care about the freedom. We've seen them already. It's people that use Linux and they know nothing about the history. They know nothing about the real reasons why they're using it. They just use it like a tool, and that's fine. But we do need to educate them on this. Some companies say they love open source. Now, there's 3 types of love. There's agape. In ancient Greek, 3 types of love. Agape, the love of God for humans, the love of mother for child. There's philos, the love of brothers for each other, from which we get Philadelphia, philanthropy, philosophy. And then there's eros, the dirtiest love, erotic love, sexual love. Some of these companies love Unix at the eros level. We have to be careful not to bend over in the shower. We are very close to world domination, but we have to keep fighting all the time. Go out and talk to people about it. Talk to your politicians about it. Talk to your educators about it. Show them that by using free software, they can teach the students 3 times. Not just how to use the software, but how the software works to solve the problems they have. How to change the software to solve the problems better. Talk about it all the time. I'm working on a bunch of different projects. Caninos Locos, I'd like to tell you, is to create a Raspberry Pi style computer inside of Brazil. The Raspberry Pi, for various reasons, costs $150 in Brazil. And these are to people whose GDP is 2/3 of ours. So I've been working for the last 5 years to create a series of computers to create the hardware platform for the Brazilian IoT program. And this month, we're producing the first 2,000 of these systems in medium-scale manufacture to get them out to people who need them and stuff. And next month, we'll be going into high-scale manufacture. Thank you. DebConf, the Debian user group who puts out Debian, will be having their meeting in Curitiba, Brazil this July. That Curitiba is my second home. It's the home of my godson, Kawa. I am part owner of a brew pub there and brew on premises place called Hop and Roll. We have 29 different beers on tap. None of them are commercial beers. And we're going to be bringing Caninos Lucos there to have the Debian people help us. And finally, I'm working on my retirement project, plus BS. Mad Dog's Monastery and Marina of math, music, microcomputing, microbrewing, microwinery, microdistillery, and bait shop. I have the architect. It will be opening in 2025. I don't know exactly where it's going to be. I have criteria. The students who will be going there will be able to walk barefoot year-round. They'll be right by the ocean, and it's going to be a complex. We're going to have conferences there. We're going to have an incubator there to create new jobs and things like that. And the students will be required to teach the high school students of the areas about computer science. So finally, it's been wonderful to come here. I haven't come here for a couple of years. I remembered a lot about this, the great people, the nice place it is, and the tie-dye t-shirts. And I'm glad none of those have changed. And why do I keep doing what I do, going around, talking to people like you? I do it because every once in a while somebody will come up to me and say, I listened to you 10 years ago, and now I'm the CTO of my company. Thank you. I listened to you 20 years ago, and now I own my own company. I employ 60 people. Thank you. I listened to you 25 years ago, and I started a small company called Digital Ocean, and I just sold it for a lot of money. Thank you. And that keeps me going. So if you want to see the most important person in free and open source software, when you get up tomorrow morning, look in the mirror. Thank you very much.